This discussion will teach you everything you need to know about US foreign policy over the last 7 decades and how we got to where we are today, how we got to a war in Ukraine, an ongoing war in Gaza, the US bombing Iran, a war in Lebanon, and in the last 2 decades, a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, and just death and destruction across the Middle East, especially Syria, Libya, Yemen. And you'd be pretty shocked at how it was all intertwined and how some enemies of the US today were allies. That includes Iran, a very close ally of the US and Israel. That includes not only Iraq, but Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a very close ally to the US against Iran. That includes Al-Qaeda. They were previously known as Mujahideen. They were allied with the US against the Soviet Union. And we'll dig into what led Putin to invade Ukraine and whether and how it could have been prevented. The discussion was great, and we plan to have yet another chat to further dig deeper into what got us here today, especially what happened after 9/11. I think you'd really enjoy the discussion, and it will give you a different perspective about all the wars that are going on, and a different way of looking at what could happen next. Scott, absolute pleasure to speak. You've been covering geopolitics for over 20 years. You've done over 6,000 interviews on your show. And we both share a very important value, which we like to call ourselves anti-war. Now, you've done an incredible job over the years in explaining how we got to where we are today. And not only, with Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, with Gaza, with Iran, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. So can you give us kind of an overview of where did it all start? Where did it all go wrong? And how did the US get itself and the world in the position we're in today?
So look, the broad strokes of it is that in the 1940s, America came out, and the Soviet Union as well came out as the big victors of World War II. And of course, we fought on Britain's side, but they were essentially an American welfare case after that. So the world was divided by the American Empire and the Soviet Empire, and what they called the bipolar world. And that lasted from, the mid to late 1940s through in the case of China, which went communist at the end of the 1940s, we ended our Cold War with them in the early 1970s, right around 50 years ago. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger decided to exploit the Sino-Soviet split, they called it, and break China off from the Soviet Union, the weaker partner in the communist alliance, basically, and ally with them and turn them against the USSR, which was a pretty effective policy then. And the Soviet Union ended up falling apart about 17 years later, 1989 through 1991. And the red flag over the Kremlin finally came down on Christmas Day, 1991. So that's the Cold War era, where the world's divided in two, and everybody's answerable either, any nation with power and influence in the world is answerable either to Washington or the Soviet Union, or they're desperately trying to get out from between us. I'll backtrack a little bit, I guess, when we get more specific about Iraq and Iran and all of that. But just in the broader strokes, at the end of the Cold War, America came up with a doctrine that said, instead of just coming home, now that the Soviet threat is gone, and now we can be a normal country in a normal time, a return to normalcy, and be a constitutional republic again, they said, nope, the world can't go on without us. We have to essentially be the world government and enforcer of world law. And they announced a doctrine. Well, they didn't announce it. It was confidential when it was written, but it was leaked. And it was the Defense Planning Guidance, which ended up being known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It's the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy back then. And his aide, Zalmay Khalilzad and Scooter Libby, wrote what was called the Defense Planning Guidance for 1994. And they wrote it in 92. And essentially said that America will not allow for any power or combination of regional powers anywhere in the world to challenge our military dominance over the planet. And we'll go to war with them first to prevent that from happening. And that's how we will guarantee world peace, is that we will start a fight. before we let anybody get powerful enough that they could really think that they could challenge us. And then we'll just keep it that way, essentially indefinitely. The problem, of course, is that we helped destroy communism in China. I mean, they still have a one-party state and a red flag and a massive welfare state and government intervention. Don't get me wrong, but it ain't Maoism. And under Maoism, you had between 30 and 40 million people starved to death. I was trying to implement Marxist economics in that country, and America convinced them to abandon all that. And Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious, and let's have property rights and markets and prices. And so, yeah, of course, look at all that manpower and the resources that they have. And with very favorable trade policies by the United States, especially, but a lot of others too, they've gotten rich and rich enough to afford their own navy. One, not powerful enough to dominate the world, but powerful enough to keep us out, so that now the Pacific Ocean is only 99% an American lake instead of 100%. And so that's the major challenge to America's global hegemony, is the rise of China. So our problems with Russia, for the most part, revolve around that. It's essentially, the question is, how do we replicate the Sino-Soviet split, the Chinese-Russian split, only this time Russia's the weaker partner, and we want to split them away from China. And so when Donald Trump, if you just forget all that crap about Russiagate, none of that was right, and just look at it in the real world. What was Donald Trump saying about why we need to get along with Russia? He was saying we need to get along with Russia so we can peel them away from China, make them more dependent on the West and friendlier with the West, so that it costs them too much to want to get too close to the Chinese, who American policymakers deem the greater threat. There's another school of thought, call it Bidenism, which says we would rather get Russia bogged down in a war in Ukraine and weaken Russia that way so that they'll be less available to help China. But it's still all about weakening China. It's a huge part of why America is determined to maintain dominance in the Persian Gulf ever since the end of the Cold War, is one, to manipulate prices to benefit or to cost the Russians, because they are major energy exporters, of course, and also to be able to cut off the Chinese. That's what Dick Cheney in 1991, when he was Secretary of Defense, called this all-important choke point on Gulf oil resources, getting out of the gates of Hormuz there, Straits of Hormuz. And so, of course, we could sink any tanker on the high seas in the event of a war with China. We don't need all this dominance anyway. But that's the premise, right? Is that America's Superman, America's Jesus, America is holding back the tide of, if it ain't communism, it's Islamist terrorism, or it's cocaine dealing, or it's Putin's revanchism, or it's Chairman Xi's
Axis of evil,
dreams of hegemony in the Pacific, or whatever the enemy is. Remember in V for Vendetta, where the dictator is ranting, I want them to remember why they need us, right? So that's America, is the world needs us, and we just came up with a whole bunch of reasons why you do.
So I want to go to, you mentioned something about weakening Russia. So maybe let's rewind back and what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
And NATO's expansion eastwards, which many look at as a broken promise to Russia, to Moscow. But also, what is the intention in weakening Russia? So maybe you can take us to that, to the whole process of how we got to Ukraine, and then the objective of, kind of what you see as dragging Russia into a war with Ukraine.
Yeah. Look, I mean, just the bottom line is that Russia is powerful enough to maintain their independence from us. It's the same grudge we have against North Korea and Cuba and China as well, that we just can't completely pwn their ass the way we do the Germans, for example, right? Where we have military bases in their country, our intelligence agencies pick their leaders, and they do as they're told and stay in line, right? The French are sometimes argumentative, but basically do what they're told. The Brits, the same. And so, but the Soviets, or the Russians, was left of the Soviet nuclear arsenal and the Kremlin that sits on top of it. They don't have to give in. And now drunken old Boris Yeltsin was a big pushover, but Vladimir Putin is not. And he really tried to suck up with the West. Biden himself said no Russian leader in all history has ever thrown in with the West as much as this guy. But it's never enough for George Bush and Dick Cheney and Barack Obama, for that matter, and Joe Biden. And these guys did everything they could, and Bill Clinton before W. Bush too, yeah, to rub it in their face. Let me put it like this, man. I bet you've heard this, or at least in my generation, we all learned this in government school, that Britain and France had such punishing terms in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, where they stripped Germany of all their territories and they forced them to pay reparations for the entire cost of the war. And they humiliated the German people, destabilized their economy and their society. They usually leave out the part about, it helped the rise of communism in the East, which was another reason that people supported the rise of Nazi reaction to hold back the red tide in the East and to essentially just get revenge and restore the dignity of the German people by retaking their lost territories and all of those things. And so we all learned that in junior high school, okay? That it was the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles that sowed the fertile grounds for the rise of the Nazi Party, right? So in World War II, well, America is a much better man, especially under the great Harry S. Truman. Boy, he knew what to do. He said, we're going to befriend the Germans and the Japanese, and we're going to rebuild them, and we're going to bring them onto our side. We're not going to colonize their countries. We're not going to destroy their countries. We're going to build them up, but we're going to bring them into our imperial fold, and that'll be great. But you see what's going on there, though, is America occupied Germany and Japan after World War II. We had total control, and we could shoot their leaders if it came down to it when we felt like it, at least West Germany. And we had the Soviet Union to hold over both of their heads, too. Oh, you prefer to be occupied by MacArthur or by Stalin's guy? And so they chose Truman and MacArthur, of course, right? Or Eisenhower in Germany. So at least the land that they could control and keep the Reds out of. So that gave the Americans tremendous influence. It was okay for them to rebuild their enemies because they had them under our thumb, right? But when the Soviet Union fell, from the Bush senior administration and the Bill Clinton administration, they said, we got to heed the lessons of Versailles. You got to make sure and treat your enemy well. Be a good sport. George Bush Sr. said, I didn't go tap dance on the Berlin Wall when it came down because I wanted to be mellow about it, which was really smart because it allowed, if America had crowed too much about the fall of the USSR, it would have lasted. It would have probably held together longer with, by strengthening hardliners. Instead, by playing it cool, it allowed the USSR really to dissolve. So it was smart in that attitude. But at the end of the day, America did not occupy Moscow. America did not have a viceroy that could dictate terms to our defeated enemies. And we didn't have a worse enemy to hold over their head. So were we really willing, we being the Bush and Bill Clinton administrations, were they really willing to help them up, to rebuild their economy, to make them an equal, friendly, allied nation like Poland and Hungary and Germany? No way. They're never going to do that. So they wanted to expand their dominance in Eastern Europe, but they were never going to include the Russians because they're too powerful. They got all these nukes. And if we were going to include them, they would have too much of a say in how we move forward. So instead, the alliance kept expanding, but only at their expense, never in a way to include them in the security arrangements that they had been promised in the first place.
Why? Because the people making those decisions are not stupid. What's their thinking back then? Obviously, hindsight's 2020, whether it's the right decision or not.
Yeah, no, it's just arrogance. They would say always, over and over, and I have all the quotes. It's in my book, Provoked. It came out last November. Is this story, and there's so many quotes over and over that ultimately, what are they going to do about it? Right? They talk like teenage bullies. That it's not that they hate the Russians; they just don't care about them. Ultimately, they're a weak country. You hear him say this all the time, right? John McCain, and people parrot this. Oh, Russia's just a gas station. It's a gas station on the upper Volga River, whatever it's called, with nuclear weapons or something. When, of course, it's the entire northern part of Asia, and it's I don't know, ancient, but it's certainly a civilization that's hundreds and hundreds of years old. Ancient is like 1,000, right? So that counts.
I'm trying to find the quote that that Putin said. I think it was an interview in Charlie Rose, that he hinted, and that was not the only example of such. They hinted that he wanted to be part of NATO. He didn't mind being, or at least considering being part of NATO.
Well, so that was the thing, right? And Bill Clinton, Secretary of Defense, even said, look, if we're going to expand NATO, we should bring Russia in first. And then when we bring in the nations in the middle, it'll be fine. Or the other alternative was we'll use the OSCE, then was called the CSCE, or what they call the Partnership for Peace, where they would all join at once. And it wouldn't even be an alliance. It would be a security partnership arrangement, because who needs an alliance? There is no enemy. So, but we'll all hash everything out at the table all together. NATO, they said, even they'll relegate to a political organization. And the CSCE, or the Partnership for Peace, they will take the forefront. And Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltics and everyone will all be involved from the beginning. That way there's nothing to fight about. Neutrality's baked in. But they weren't ever going to really do that, right? That was essentially a ruse. That was what they sold the Russians, first the Soviets, then the Russians, to get them to acquiesce and say, okay, fine, I guess you can allow Germany to reunite. And okay, fine, get Yeltsin drunk enough, you'll get him to mutter that I guess he doesn't object too much if Poland joins NATO and this kind of thing. And so then they keep going forward. But the idea always was, to paraphrase one of the first leaders of NATO, Lord Ismay from Great Britain, said that the purpose of NATO is to keep America in, Germany down, and the Soviets out. And so
America in, Germany down, and the Soviets out.
That's right. So it's not the Soviets now, it's just the Russians. But it's, yes, it's to prevent, as James Baker put it to Gorbachev when they were haggling over the promises about whether to expand NATO or not, whether they would expand NATO or not. He says to Gorbachev, he goes, listen, I mean, you want us still here, right? You don't want an independent Germany with its own nuclear weapons and its own foreign policy. And Gorbachev said, actually, James Baker, you make a real good point, right? Even after this is during the Cold War still, right? Or, you know, it's still the Soviet Union, the communists. And they're saying, yeah, we prefer America to the Germans, even though we could have nuked them off the face of the earth. We never did, but the Germans did everything but that to them twice. And so they're saying, yeah. And that's, of course, what England wants too, is for America to be the dominant power in Europe so that Germany's not. And in fact, it probably reassures the Poles and the French too, that like when America is the balancer on the continent, it means nobody else can be. And they don't have to fight over it all the time the way they always have, which is fine until the American people go completely bankrupt and all have to live you know, in their car in the Walmart parking lot. And then at some point, somebody's going to have to figure out something else.
Is it possible that, I know you said this arrogance was one of the reasons, or the main reason they didn't accept Russia to join NATO, but is it possible that they saw Russia as a potential threat? So like they needed to keep it weak so it does not become an enemy later on. It doesn't become a Cold War rival in the future.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Is by threat, they just mean powerful enough to remain independent from us. Does anybody think Russia's really coming to Berlin or to Paris or to Washington or to Spokane, the other Washington, right? No, they're not. That nobody thinks that. The question is just whether, you know, we are going to be able to completely freeze them out of Caspian oil resources, or whether they're going to get a pipeline too, right? Whether we're going to be able to bring Ukraine into our military alliance, or whether that's a bridge too far, pal. These are the questions that we're talking about, right? We're not talking about them going anywhere else. We're talking about just how far can America push it before this thing blows up and a bunch of people get killed, which is what we're watching in Ukraine now.
When do you think Russia realized that they'll never get a chance to join NATO?
Oh, I think Putin knew that pretty early on. He asked in July of 2001, and Colin Powell blew him off. And I think he may have asked W. Bush again in 2002. But he understands, you know, he's a sharp enough guy to see that, look, they're not going to do that. There's too much at stake. And then, you know, I never really thought about it this way, but of course, this makes a lot of sense. I should have thought about this myself, which is, and I didn't mention this in my book because I didn't think of it till the other day, but there's a lot of things on the list, but Larry Johnson, the former CIA officer, pointed out to me it's the obvious thing, right? It's the purloined letter. I should have thought of this. It's sitting right there. Putin opposed the invasion of Iraq. He's sitting on the UN Security Council. And if he'd supported the invasion of Iraq, he could have probably got China to go along and at least abstain. But it was clear that Russia and probably China would vote no, which is a veto, right? It has to be unanimous to get a UN Security Council resolution through. The French may have vetoed it anyway, but that Vladimir Putin was not helpful on Iraq War II. That pissed them off, man. They were so sure how right they were during that time, man. It's hard to recreate the spirit of that time. That, like, you could see how they would have really reacted angrily when they found out that, man, the Russians are immovable on this. And they wouldn't have to participate. They just have to legalize it by voting in the Security Council to do it. And instead, they left it an illegal, aggressive war under the law, even though it was regardless of the law. But you understand what I mean.
But that was after the 2001 Colin Powell brushing him off. So Putin was already brushed off. So that's probably why he voted no on the Iraq invasion, and he didn't play ball. Because even in Afghanistan, he was a lot more supportive. He was the first one to call the president at 9/11. So he still, at least from the outside, you look at it, he still had hope.
I think he might have voted against. I think he might have tried to stop the war with Iraq anyway. He's a smart enough guy. Iraq is, if you're from Texas, like W. Bush is nominally from Texas. Iraq might as well be that cartoon in Aladdin, right? It's a make-believe place to W. Bush. He didn't know the first thing about it. He said, what is all this talk about Sunnis and Shiites? I thought they were all Muslims. And that was right before the war, okay? This is just an imaginary place. Yes, he said that. This might as well have been the dark side of Mars to W. Bush. But to Vladimir Putin, he understood good and well what Iraq was and what it's going to be. If you go all the way to Baghdad and do a violent regime change there, boy, you can see the dominoes that are going to fall down. All you had to do was really know the first thing about it, right? That starting that war was for people who don't know the first thing about it. Anybody who did knew better than to do that.
The people that were by George Bush's side, they kind of convinced him to start that war. They knew what could happen. They've seen what happened in Iran. They've seen what happened in Iraq prior to that. So they probably knew what they were into. They were very ambitious. They were very optimistic about what they could achieve.
Yeah, they had very detailed plans about how it's supposed to work, which of course completely backfired. And I say this every day, but I urge your audience to read The Clean Break. It's from 1996. It's by David Wormser, the important neoconservative apparatchik. And it's called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm, which he wrote for Netanyahu. And the idea was that they want to steal the rest of Palestine. They want to cancel Oslo. They want to not do a two-state solution at all. Forget that. We're going to colonize the rest of Palestine. But the problem is Hezbollah on our northern border. So what we want to do is we want to neutralize Iranian support for Hezbollah through Syria by overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. What? And now the reason that's supposed to make sense to them was they thought they would get a Hashemite king and that he would use his Mohammedan blood to lord it over the Iraqi Shiites and make the Iraqi Shiite clergy tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran. And then they later replaced that with Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, was supposed to be the one to take over. And again, was going to pressure, I guess, the Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani down there in Najaf to tell Nasrallah to stop being friends with Iran and start being friends with Israel. That way the Israelis can finish colonizing all of Palestine. And it was based on this complete idiot thinking by David Wormser and Richard Pearl, who were two of the most powerful neoconservatives, and their reassurances to Bush that, oh yeah, this is going to be great. As Wormser said, if we install a supermajority Shiite government in Iraq, it'll be a nightmare for Iran. But no, stupid. It just put Iran's very best friends in power in Iraq, who didn't even say thank you. They just said get out after we were done fighting the civil war for them in 2003 through 8 there.
We're going to get to the clean break because that's where it gets really confusing. We'll break it down for the audience. We just did. We jumped right into it. I want to go back to, because obviously Ukraine's in the headlines. I want to take a step back and how we got to the Ukraine war. So you had the fall of the Soviet. NATO expanded. They did not let Russia join, which just imagine the world will be in today if Russia was part of NATO. I would like to look at it as, Russia and the US could be allies, would have prevented a war in Ukraine. Maybe I'm wrong. But where did they get it wrong, or did they get it wrong? Did they get Ukraine wrong, or was it part of the plan? How did we get there? What was the plan? Look,
I mean, when I say they're arrogant, I mean, just think of the perfect avatar for all of this. Pick, I guess, which gender you're most sexist against, either Joe Biden or Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland. Like, these are the two most belligerent, know-nothing, know-it-all, just bat-headed idiots that you could possibly have. Think of John McCain up there on stage, standing next to Ola Tannibok, the leader of the Social National Party. Right? Get it? The social nationalists? I saw a guy on Twitter joking. He goes, yeah, get it? That's like the exact opposite of a national socialist. And there's John McCain up there going, I'm right, I'm smart, I know what I'm doing. But no, he's not right, and he's not smart, and he doesn't know what he's doing. All right, he's sticking it to Russia. He knows that. But does he really know who Tannibok is? Does he understand the history of Ukraine in any way, the culture of the country, and its, severe cultural and regional divisions and any of these things? Does he know or care about any of that? Of course not. Him and Joe Biden, they don't sit around reading books. Imagine, just try to picture like as hard as you can, Joe Biden with a stack of books about Ukraine to read. No, never happened. Never could happen. Right. But this is the guy who decides, oh, I know what to do. What we're going to do is whatever I want because I'm so smart and we're doing this thing. And if you look at people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, as I show in the book, after the Maidan Revolution of 2014, Brzezinski, who had been a major hawk, and Henry Kissinger too, they both had been hawks, major advocates of NATO expansion. They both said, oh man, you know what? That's it. We should stop here. Right. With Victoria Nuland driving, this ain't a safe trip. Here's what we should do. We should come up with a special status for Ukraine, like Finland and Austria during the old Cold War, where they are neutral. They're not part of the Warsaw Pact, and they're not part of NATO, not part of Russia's alliance, nor ours. And we let them be a bridge between East and West instead of having a fight over it. So, of course, Ron Paul thought that. And of course, over at antiwar.com, we always advocated neutrality for everybody as best as we can manage, of course. But this is Brzezinski and Kissinger themselves. These are the leaders of the NATO expansionist movement. And Brzezinski, particularly in his book in 1997, talked about it's so important that we keep Ukraine under our domination and, so that the Russians can't have it. I forget if he outright states this, but the implication clearly being that eventually we're going to kick them out of their naval base in Sevastopol on Crimea, and it'll be ours. And so he, by however many years later, 7 years later, something, he's backing off of that. Or I'm sorry, I'm terrible at math on the fly. But did he say
they want to overextend Russia? Is he the one that said that?
No, that was the Rand Corporation. Yeah, so the Rand Corporation, this is really important. Anyone can look this up. It'll take you 20 minutes to read. It's nothing, okay? You knock it right out. It's called Extending Russia. And by that, they mean overextending Russia. And by that, they mean provoking Russia into having to do expensive things. Keep them bogged down, keep them distracted. You know what we could do? We could host more exercises in the Baltic states. We could sanction this before Nord Stream 2 was open. We could sanction and prevent the Nord Stream pipeline from being completed. We could try again to do a coup d'etat in Belarus. We could try to agitate against Russian partners in Kazakhstan. We could pour more weapons into the terrorists in the Idlib province in Syria. Yes, it led to the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate last time, but it would cause a hassle for Assad and a hassle for the Russians, and that would cost them too. And they said, and we could pour more weapons into Ukraine. Now that will force the Russians to also counter and spend more money backing the insurgency there. Now, importantly, you go down the list of all of these provocations that they recommend. Two good examples are, if we back the jihadists in Syria, that could really lead to a rise of bin Ladenite terrorism that we really don't want to do. Yes,
so they knew about the risk. They knew about the risk that
That's
comes in Afghanistan and in Syria. And so that think tank, the Rand Corporation, you're saying they're the ones that had a strategy to extend or overextend Russia. And did that apply? So maybe you can explain to the audience very briefly, because we're going to get to Afghanistan and the Middle East in a bit. But how did they achieve that? With Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, they kind of bogged down. They created kind of a Vietnam for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And was that the same thinking in Ukraine?
Yeah. So now if you get to 2000, okay, well, first of all, in the Rand Corporation study, the way that they phrase it is, now listen, if we, again, with the disclaimers, if we pour in more weapons to Ukraine and therefore benefit Kiev's side in the ongoing civil war in the East, which of course was going on beginning in 2014, right? Russia massively escalated the war when they invaded in 2022, right? But between that time, there was an ongoing war. And they said, if we pour more weapons into Kiev, that could provoke Russia into not only having to spend more money and things like that, but they could actually outright intervene and invade and take territory from Ukraine, which would be a major cost to our friends, the Ukrainians, and could be a major humiliation for us in international politics in the world, and a major black eye. And so we should be very careful about that, right? And I don't remember specifically, but if you go down the entire list of recommendations in there, every single one of them has a big disclaimer at the bottom. They go, here's some heinous things that you could do. And then they go, boy, but you better not, because if you do, this is what might happen. And they go down the whole list like that. And so now if you want to fast forward a bit to what happened is exactly that. They poured in more weapons. In fact, in the Rand Corporation study, they say we must carefully calibrate the amount of weapons that we're pouring in, right? You're supposed to like picture a dial where this many shoulder fired anti-tank missiles per month are coming in. And if you put in not enough, the Russians will come in because they'll see their advantage. And if you put in too many, that'll be a provocation. So you have to calibrate the number of missiles that you're sending in just right. Okay. They use the exact same language right in the run up to the war. They said that to the New York Times. Well, we're carefully calibrating the amount of weapons that we're pouring in. And then one CIA officer or a couple CIA officers talked to a reporter named Zach Dorfman at Yahoo News. And they said, the calibration is off. And they said, it's not our fault. We tried to tell the bosses. These are CIA officers stationed in Ukraine, and they're in charge of distributing the weapons when they arrive. This is before the war, right before the war. And they're like receiving planes
before the invasion
of 22.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before the invasion of 22. And the Extending Russia, I'm sorry, I should have said the Extending Russia study that we're talking about came out in 19. Okay. So the CIA officers tell Zach Dorfman, they say, listen, we told the bosses back home to tell the White House to stop sending the weapons. The calibration is off. What we're doing is we're not sending in enough weapons to deter an attack. We're sending in enough weapons to provoke one, to make Russia decide that, look, this war is going to happen sooner or later. America is making Ukraine's military a de facto member of the NATO alliance. They don't have our war guarantee, but their military is being normalized more and more along NATO lines in terms of their order of battle and their all their order of just rank and everything else, all their communication systems, and more their weapons systems are integrated with the West in a way where, if you imagine a full conventional NATO war with the Russian Federation, that theirs would be just another auxiliary army along with Hungary and Lithuania and Germany and Poland and the rest. And so the Russian question was, and because the Americans have promised, we're skipping around a bit here, but the Americans have promised, okay, we're going to expand NATO, but we promise never to move weapons into the new NATO countries or have permanent bases in the new NATO countries. But then they violated those promises.
I didn't know that was a promise. That was an overt promise?
Yeah, it was an overt promise from Bill Clinton in 1997 when they created the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council in 1997. And of course, the promise wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and they just find whatever loopholes, and they put anti-ballistic missile systems in Romania and Poland, and they have permanent bases in Poland and in Lithuania, and I think in Bulgaria, definitely in Romania and Lithuania. And so they break all those promises, and Bush promised. He didn't give them a real deal, but he promised them that one day you'll get a deal to join NATO. Bush made that promise in 2008. And so, in other words, Bush was saying, like, getting he's getting Ukraine in trouble with their powerful next door neighbor by promising one day I'm going to help you fight him, but I ain't promising that I'm going to do that yet. Right. So that puts the Russians in the position of having potentially a mortal threat right on their border, just 300 miles from Moscow, 300 miles from St. Petersburg there, where, as Putin said, they could station missile systems in Kharkiv, where a Tomahawk cruise missile be in Moscow in 30 minutes or 15 or whatever it was, hypersonics in 5 minutes. And so it just, if you picture the map of far Eastern Europe here, Russia is not a straight line down, right? It hooks hard in. Ukraine is to the south there, like just very close to Russia's most important cities. And this is one of the routes that the Germans and the French took when they invaded Russia in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hills or rivers or mountains or anything to protect them there. So this is why Stalin kept all of Eastern Europe, was because this is his buffer zone to keep the West away. And so America's just intent on canceling that advantage. Imagine if I move into your neighborhood and then I move onto your front lawn with all of my guys and all of my guns, and I go, what's a defensive alliance? You just stay in your house and you won't have a problem. And then you're gonna what? Tell the old lady, well, he said it was a defensive alliance. Or no, you're gonna have to take measures into your own hands to provide for your own security, right?
When Russia was amassing all the men and the equipment on Ukraine's borders, and the US was warning invasions is imminent, invasion's imminent, did the US have the opportunity to prevent the invasion then?
Yes, I believe so. And I'll tell you this way, man. I think that plan A, and this is so clear in hindsight too, that plan A was to tell the Russians, you better not do it. And that was from the very beginning. Burns went to Moscow at the very beginning of November, and he met personally with Lavrov, and he had like a Skype call or whatever with Putin and said, don't invade. And if you do, we will support an insurgency against you. So the presumption was that the Russian army would be able to roll right to Kiev, that they would smash the Ukrainian military, and that America would then be backing an insurgency, on the western side of the Dnieper River, at least, rather than backing an outright, state army. In fact, the Ukrainian army lasted, and we've been backing them rather than, just militias this whole time. So we're on plan C, but nowhere in there was negotiate a way out of this crisis. Plan A was you better not. Plan B was we're going to arm up resistance against you, and we're going to inflict incredible costs on you, right? Just like in the extending Russia thing, we're going to extend your ass. We're going to bog you down. We're going to bleed you to bankruptcy is what we're going to do to you. And then if you go back and under those terms, look at, and then again, as I say, since the Ukrainian military didn't get smashed, they just keep backing the Ukrainian state rather than this insurgency they had imagined backing, which is even better from their point of view, right? But if you look at December of 21 and January and February of 22, they refused to negotiate their way out of this, and they absolutely could have. And for people who say, and I have to tell you, man, it's such, and people ought to be pissed off about this by now, I think. This whole claim that Vladimir Putin was determined to recreate the Soviet Union, so he launched this aggressive just war of land conquest and all that, is such a damned lie. It's such a stupid lie. It is equivalent to Saddam Hussein is making nuclear weapons and he's going to kill your mama with them. Bull. It's not true at all. It was America that picked this fight by extending our military alliance right up to their border, by starting and then refusing to solve the ongoing civil war in the east of the country and all that, right? So they, based on that premise, they lead the people of this country to believe that there's essentially no other choice here, right? This guy, it's like Islam makes them hate our freedom. So there's no way you can talk them out of it. There's nobody to negotiate with. There's nothing reasonable that you can do here other than kill the enemy until they're dead to protect your people. That's it, right? So it's the same thing they said about David Koresh. It's the same thing they said about Saddam and Assad and whatever. They're crazy. They're crazy, which means you can't negotiate with them. It means they have some weird ideological or religiously motivated goal that can't be understood properly or reasoned with by a Western gentleman. All you can do is
but then you form alliances with them, as you did with Saddam in this war against Iran.
Details. Al-Qaeda. Yeah.
So those same crazy people were your allies at one stage.
Yeah, of course, but it's all just excuse making, so that they don't have to deal. And if you go back and look at the actual gripe, as the Russians put it, here are security concerns. We want them addressed. Let's meet and discuss this treaty. And the Biden government refused to deal with them in good faith whatsoever. In fact, there's a podcast where a guy named Derek Chollet, who's a State Department guy going back to at least the Clinton years, is a historian. He was part of these negotiations, and he did a podcast with War on the Rocks where he said, we refuse to discuss NATO with them at all. The only thing we would say about NATO is, and of course he's like crowing and beating his chest because he's all in like the current thing at the time that he's saying this like horrible admission. He's just boasting that all we told them was, Ukraine, NATO is a defensive alliance. That's it. You're just going to have to learn to love it. We got nothing else to say to you about it. It's a defensive alliance, so you have no right to claim you feel threatened, and we don't even believe you that you do say that you are. And it's just, that was their attitude. They would not negotiate over missiles. And the Russians had what, a 17-point treaty or a 13-point treaty or something to negotiate. They refused to even sit down and negotiate it. It was all like, you know what we'll do? We'll have our deputy undersecretary do a side thing with you about maybe we'll be able to come up with some accommodation about a promise, but not a treaty, about missile emplacements in the future that we know that we can tear up and ignore at our first notice. And like, they refused to take it seriously. And in fact, I even have a quote in the book where Putin said something very close to, I think they might be trying to trap us into this war. They want us to feel like we have no choice but to do this, but then we're not going to have a choice but to do it, because that's how they're doing it, is they are making Ukraine's military so closely integrated with the American military alliance that we are going to have to stop it before it gets any further. And so he went for it anyway. He fell for it anyway.
So there's the argument that, you know, these countries have the right to join NATO. They're sovereign nations. They have the right to make that decision. I just find that to be a weak, it's a fair argument, but a weak one. Because if you didn't make the same argument about, you know, Cuba joining the Soviet, or now China, or obviously Mexico or Canada forming an alliance with China, China moving military equipment there, it's just such an easy argument to kind of poke holes into. But let's try to understand then, why did the US do this? What are the reasons? Is it the military? You know, a lot of people like to blame the military industrial complex, you know, kind of keep creating weapons and making money through these wars, these forever wars. Or is it more a strategic way to weaken Russia? Or is it maybe a bit of both? And if it is a bit of both, can you give each one a bit of, you know, kind of weighting? How big of a role did each one play in that war?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to quantify these things, right? But it's always a big conspiracy of interests. So like all the single white females in the liberal Twitter swarm, they all got a big dopamine rush. That was probably 20% of the entire war party at that time, right? I mean, it was a huge influence. There's a really interesting writer named John Robb with 2 B's, Global Guerrillas. And he wrote about what was then the pre-Musk liberal Twitter swarm, and just the enforcers of all vaccine mandates and Ukrainian talking points and all things, the way that was then, that even when Biden wanted to negotiate, they wouldn't let him. We're fighting satanic Russian orcs, and the level of emotion was up to 10. I bring that up, just, it's almost comical, but like, that was a huge part of it, was the groupthink among the people, like the lower ranks of the American political class. Like, oh, what a fun and exciting thing to believe in together. You might be familiar with the comedian Kurt Metzger, where he had this great bit. I'm going to ruin it for everybody. He had this great bit. He starts out, it was from 22, and he's going, let me ask you, audience, is it wrong to invade the sovereign nation of Ukraine? And they're all laughing because, of course, they were just beating us over the head with that narrative so bad right then. Is it wrong? He's like, yeah, of course it is. Of course it's wrong. Of course it's wrong. And he goes, but it did kind of cure COVID, right? And then because that was the deal, because all the single white liberal females finally shut up about one thing and changed their subject to something else. So this is what we're being censored over now. This is what we're being lorded over now with the current thing. And it was a stark switch at the time, but it worked, as he pointed out. But of course, look, you have the military industrial complex. Think about how much it costs to send a group of Marines to patrol Paktika province, right? Compared to getting rid of B-21 long-range nuclear bombers and, you know, aircraft carriers and submarines. Cold War with major powers. That's where the money's at. Now, they might get our entire civilization blown off the face of the earth forever and destroy everything our ancestors have built over the last few thousand years and all of that. But in the meantime, though, man, think of the profit margin on an aircraft carrier. That's a good one if you got the sale, and, you know, that's a hell of a bonus. Pay for your kids' private school. So everybody involved in that process is self-interested, and that's the Pentagon itself is the empire, man. I mean, even just look at the the number of golf courses and villas and things that the generals and admirals own across the world. They don't want to give that up, right? They don't want to give up all those fancy little decorations on their shirts that most of them did not earn, right? They're just, they're not combat badges, right? They're surfing and typing and a bunch of garbage, right? Like on I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker. And then of course you have all TV news. They want to sell dish soap, and their ad rates fluctuate based on their eyeballs, all day long, on an hourly basis, on a daily basis. So if there's foreign excitement going on and eyeballs tuning in, they can double and triple their charge for dish soap. So they got all that. You got every bureaucrat in every bit of the bureaucracy. They all want to participate in whatever the big thing is, man. And asking them to turn it off and like for that to be the greater virtue is that, hey man, what if we just didn't this time? That just doesn't exist. That's not how they operate, man. All the empire is a big dirty snowball rolling downhill. And so get in on it if you can. Think of all of the Twitter people who do, like, you're a Twitter host, right? But think of all the people whose job it is to have essentially your same gig, only promoting all this stuff. Got to support Israel, got to support the war, got to fight the Muslims, got to fight the Russians, got to fight the Chinese. It's us versus the world and the world versus us. There's a lot of interest in pushing that stuff, man.
So you've just got all these different misaligned incentives that just worked against U.S. interests, the U.S. as a nation. And now you've just got a country that's heavily in debt, that's spread extremely thin, and that's just alienated so many countries because of these misaligned incentives and all these different lobbying groups.
I totally think that's so well said. That's exactly it, man. That's exactly it. When I was a kid, I remember Ross Perot, when he ran for president in 92, he would rail against the special interests. And I remember asking, like, what does that mean? What is a special interest? And nobody could ever explain it real well. But now that we're grown up, it means banking and war and agribusiness and Israel. And I mentioned the arms dealers again, oil, the biggest industries, Silicon Valley, the biggest industries who have the biggest interests in controlling the most powerful lobbyists to control the Congress, to control the national government, to get their way at our expense. What a special interest means, it's not the national interest, it's some jerk and his company at the expense of everybody else.
Special interests should be rebranded to misaligned interests. I think that's a better way of looking at them. Another question I have for you is, then why did Russia, obviously we looked at various reasons on why Russia invaded Ukraine, but what is the main reason? Because there's three of them that people usually like to use as an excuse or as a reason. One is, as you said, the Ukrainian military was being strengthened, is becoming a threat to Russia. And obviously, the coup that made it a US ally. Number two is NATO expansion is getting closer and closer to Russia's doorsteps, and now there's a threat that Ukraine could join NATO. And number three, what you disagree with, is many saying that Putin had ambitions and saw Ukraine as part of Russia, which you think is as you said, BS. Out of those three reasons, which one would you say is the main reason? I know it's not the territorial one. I want to ask you if that played any factor in your opinion, and which one do you think played a bigger role, the strength of the Ukrainian military or the risk of the Ukrainian military, of Ukraine joining NATO?
Yeah, it was the threat of Ukraine's de facto integration into NATO.
Even if it's unofficial, just the strengthening of the military and they call it
interoperability, right? Which means standardizing their military to operate the same way that ours does, and would, armed up with our weapons on our chain of command and our communications networks and our order of battle, restructure your military the way we want you to, so that we can use it if we need it. It's no different than how we operate with the rest of the NATO countries in Eastern Europe, right? Is you standardize the way that you do war with us, so that when we all got to do it together, you will fight under unified NATO command. So that's really what they were doing. And at the same time, and I don't think any less important, was the ongoing civil war in the east of the country, supported by the United States, really launched by the United States. I mean, John Brennan, the head of the CIA, the same guy who led Al-Qaeda forces in Syria, the same guy who framed Donald Trump for treason, is the same guy who, I don't know specifically his role in the coup, but immediately after the overthrow in 2014, he went to Kiev and demanded that the new interim president, Turchynov, launch the anti-terrorist operation. He went there on April 12th and 13th, and they launched the war on the 14th. And it was John Brennan who had them do that. And so this ongoing war, it did not have to be this way at all. They had an official peace deal called Minsk I and Minsk II. The second was signed in February of 15. And it was the Americans and Kiev that refused to implement the thing. They complained about the deal. Well, they signed it. It was Merkel and Holland, our closest allies from Germany and France, who arranged the deal. Obama rubber stamped it. The UN Security Council rubber stamped it. It was international law. And then Kiev said, no, actually, the rebels have to lay down all their arms and give up all their territory to our control, and then we can hold elections. Well, that was not the deal. And they ruined the deal that way. And the Americans Obama was still there for another 2.5 years. Under 3 years, under Obama, under Trump, and under Biden, they refused to force them to implement the Minsk II deal. And in fact, when Trump was in there the first time, his ambassador, William Taylor, told Zelensky, brand new President Zelensky in 2019, to not sign on to a German proposal to reorder the implementation structure a little bit in a way that was supposed to be a compromise that both sides could agree on. And the Americans went in there and ruined the deal. William Taylor went in there and told Zelensky not to sign it and not to do it. And this is when he's got a bunch of neo-Nazis on his right threatening to murder him if he does, holding these no to capitulation rallies. And right when he needs American support, he's got none. And so he goes, okay, well, I guess I better not sign any deal with the Russians. I mean, we all talk about the peace deal that got ruined in early 22, but how about the peace deal that America ruined in 19? The Steinmeier formula, the German proposal for implementing Minsk II. And I'll tell you this, it was those two together, man, more than anything. If it had been one or the other, if we'd had the Civil War, but without the threat of NATO expansion or vice versa, it wouldn't have been the same. But think of it from the point of view of Russian politics. What a punk Putin looked like. And in fact, they tried again, just like in the Rand Corporation study, they tried again to overthrow the government of Belarus in 2020. That was the third time. They tried it in 01 and in 05. Then they tried again to overthrow the government of Belarus, the single most important country to Russia by far. And what they get out of it in anger and reaction.
Has anything changed today? We got the peace agreement being negotiated now. Has the strategy in the US under Trump with the whole MAGA movement getting sick of all these wars, is that leading to some sort of change in Ukraine? Because at least in the Middle East, which we might talk about later on, it just seems like the same thing's repeating itself all over again as we've seen over the last few decades. And I'm worried the same thing will happen in Ukraine.
I'm very sorry to say that I'm very pessimistic now about the war because the Russians are winning and they got no reason to quit. It's a real paradox in the way that the war is being fought, though. Both sides say this. The Ukrainians say the same thing, that they're fighting a war of attrition, that they're not exactly fighting over the land. That'll come someday. But they're basically fighting a war over how many of the other guys can I kill, and just trying to rack up body counts. And that eventually the idea is the other side will just break or turn tail and run. Now, the Ukrainians have been on the defensive nonstop since really September of 22. They launched a big failed offensive in the early summer of 23 that went nowhere. And have essentially been on their back foot the whole time since then. However, the Russians are moving very slowly. So they control virtually all of Luhansk, but they still don't control all of Donetsk, much less Zaporozhye and Kherson, the other two major oblasts that they have officially claimed to annex. So, either Putin's got to climb way down and draw new lines, or the Ukrainians got to be convinced to just turn around and leave the field where they still control major parts of these territories, which they don't want to do. Their state, their military is still standing. And so Ukraine is not.
And they've got the capital cities. I think they've got the main cities in Kherson and Zaporizhia as well. And they've got, 25% of each oblast of these two, and then about 20% of Donetsk.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But President Zelensky made it clear that he's not going to give up any territory there. He wants to hold the line. He said this is a threat for future Russian attacks. At least that's his argument. And Donald Trump put out a post today. I'm not sure if you saw it. It shows a shift in strategy. There's two posts. One of them, he says, it is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's a complete shift from the Trump we saw a few months ago, most likely a negotiating strategy. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense, but is not allowed to play offense. There is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden attacks Joe Biden. He did not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. How did that work out? Regardless, it is a war that would have never happened if I were president. Zero chance. Interesting times ahead. President TJT. I'm not sure if you've seen that post, but what do you make of it?
Well, it can obviously be read two ways, right? That he could be saying, he could be threatening that he could escalate with attacks inside Russia. He doesn't.
That's how I read it. Yeah.
He doesn't really seem. I don't think so. I think what he's saying is, if Putin had not tied their hands behind their back, maybe they could have won, but he did, and it's too late now. And so, I think that's what he's saying, is that I don't think there was any direct kind of implication that maybe now we're going to change that policy and start arming them and asking them to attack inside Ukraine, inside Russia. I mean, which of course they have been doing with American help. There have been drone attacks, and they even, of course, invaded Kursk, last fall and stayed there, through the winter, basically, right? Create a little salient there inside Russia proper. So, and look, Joe Biden was right to at least say we can only go this far, but not further. If we intervene directly, or if we really help Ukraine take this war to Russia, that could lead to a general war between NATO and the Russian Federation. And that risks H-bomb exchanges. And, I don't know, I'm not the world's best expert on this, but I have read quite a bit about this, and I've interviewed a lot of experts about this, where in all of the nuclear war games that they host and play over and over again, whenever atom bombs start going off, it ends up devolving into general war, right? Like potentially you could have a war between India and Pakistan, but even then China might jump in on Pakistan's side, and America could then warn China that you better not or else, and you could have things spin right out of control right there. Right. In an area where we weren't even looking. And potential, especially any war between NATO and the Russian Federation, means we're dead. It means essentially every major city in America and Europe and Russia wiped off the face of the earth. That's what it means. If we fight Russia, that's the direction it goes. So Joe Biden said, look, man, we're going to wage this proxy war as hell, but we're not going any further than that. And rule number 2, supposedly from General Milley, was keep the war geographically contained to inside Ukraine. Because regardless of what Trump says, otherwise you're nuts, man. I mean, imagine that Ukraine had got their act together and went further than Kursk and started marching on Moscow. What do you think the Kremlin would do?
There was already talk of using a tactical nuke, giving a warning. I can't remember who it was that was speaking about it very openly in Russia. And not a fringe politician, someone pretty vocal, and not a moderate, but not too extreme. You're saying about using a tactical nuke, but in a smart way, like giving a warning for the Ukrainians, 3 days warnings for them to evacuate a certain territory, and then using that tactical nuke to kind of disrupt their supply lines. See, it's just terrifying that we're even discussing that as a possibility. And you're saying that if one would read Trump's post, which again I see as a negotiating tactic, but that there's a possibility that Ukraine could go on the offense, start going deep into Russian territory, that could lead into a direct confrontation with NATO, despite kind of the mending of relations between Trump and Putin.
Well, that's the whole thing is, at the end of the day, these guys are in charge of major nation states. So I'm glad that they get along very well. And I wish that they would make the absolute most of that they possibly can. But I'm just saying, look at the map and look at where Moscow is in comparison. And look, the good news here is that Ukraine doesn't have the ability to march on Moscow any more than they have the ability to take back the Crimean Peninsula or drive the Russians out of Donetsk, right? They can't. And so that's the good news, right? If there was a real threat to the Russian nation from Ukraine, then it would be even more imperative that we call for a ceasefire. It'd be better to watch Ukraine lose and watch Russia itself lose. I don't mean lose in Ukraine, but I mean Russia itself be invaded and beaten by Ukraine, because they're not going to allow that. They will start fusing hydrogen isotopes together before they allow that to happen to themselves. The same as would happen if someone was marching on Washington, D.C. Somebody would get nuked before they just lay down their guns and go home, of course.
What do you make of the other post by Trump posting a photo of Nixon and Khrushchev back during the Cold War? I'm not sure if you've seen that one. Have you seen that one on Truth Social?
No, I like that, though.
What do you make of it?
Look, I believe
nothing
that
else. There's no text with the post.
Yeah, I believe that Trump is sincere in wanting to end the war. You know, and I'm not sure what that picture is, by the way. If that's like him showing is that the washing machine tour or whatever? I don't think I guess what I would say is my initial impression of that is he's not boasting about when the Americans are kind of showing up the Soviets. He was saying, you know, look, previous Republicans negotiating with Russians, and that's why it's good to do, which is right. This is what, you know, we talked about before. Only Nixon can go to China, right? It was Nixon who went, but as I said at the time, only he could, because otherwise, if anyone else went, Nixon would have called him a commie, right? It had to be Nixon to go and shake hands with Mao, because everybody knows Nixon's not a commie, right? He's the one who put Alger Hiss in prison. So, or at least correctly accused him of being a commie traitor. So Nixon can go and shake hands with Mao in a way that nobody else could get away with. It's the same thing with Ronald Reagan making deals with Gorbachev and Bush Sr. to make deals with Gorbachev to end the Cold War, and could potentially be the same thing for Trump now. I have said, and I really am sincere about this, I'm not a utopian. And when I say I'm anti-war, I'm talking about America's era of phony wars and imperialism. That doesn't mean no one should ever fight to defend themselves or whatever. I'm not a hippie. I'm just saying, you know, it should definitely not be this way at all.
I want to kind of summarize what you said, what we've discussed there. We've discussed kind of the American foreign policy and how it led to where we are today in Europe and after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I want to make that comparison. I made it earlier very briefly to what we're seeing in another region that's just going through a heartbreaking war, and that's in the Middle East. We've seen that in obviously Gaza, in Lebanon, and in the 12-day war with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
But most people don't know the history there. Most people don't understand that Iran was one of the closest allies in the Middle East to Israel. Iran, even after the revolution, was not an ally of Israel, but Israel was supplying weapons to Iran after the revolution, after Khomeini took power. And that was through the US. There's all these different complications. Let's just give maybe a similar crash course for the audience on how the hell we got to a level where the US fought a war in Afghanistan, fought a war in Iraq, is funding a war right now. You kind of lean back because that was a lot uglier. That was a lot that needs at least 4 or 5 hours. It's funding a war in Palestine, in Israel-Palestine. How did the Middle East get to the mess it is today, and what is the end game? But let's maybe go back to the maybe the coup in the 1950s in Iran, since this is this is the other big war that we faced in the last few months.
Sure. Well, again, it's all part of the Cold War with the Soviet Union at the time and maintaining American dominance in the region to keep them out. So the big enemy at the time was Arab nationalism, and especially socialism and communism. So picking up where the British left off, America favored Islamists mostly, and in some cases Baathists, such as in the case of Saddam Hussein, who the CIA began grooming back in 1958, I think was the first time that they started backing him. And
just to be clear, for the people listening, that's the same Saddam Hussein that the US ended up leading to his death and led to the Iraq War. That's the same Saddam Hussein that the US was backing. Most people don't know this, but Saddam Hussein was initially backed by the US and was almost allied with the US against Iran.
Yeah, and then he had been the head of intelligence for a while. Then the dictator that he had served was overthrown, and so he had gone into exile in Cairo, where America supported him more again. Then he came back and was the second number. He was the number 2 guy to a guy named Al-Bakr, I believe, who was closer to the Soviet Union and really helped build up Iraq's military forces with Soviet tanks and that kind of thing. But then I forget if Hussein killed the guy or just kicked him upstairs, kicked him out of power, or not even upstairs, but just pushed him out of the way and did a coup d'etat and took over in 1979. And then for reasons I'll be explaining in a moment, I guess, the Americans ended up befriending him again, taking his side again.
Yeah,
So
he forced him to resign, did not kill him. He lived under quiet house arrest until his death about 3 years after he was deposed.
oh, okay. So now another part of maintaining American dominance in the Middle East was backing a coup d'etat against the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was the son of the old dictator. And he had been in there himself for a little while and then had been overthrown. And they had created a parliamentary system. And America, in fact, had even favored the rise of Mossadegh in the beginning, the democratically elected prime minister, because they thought he'd be a good counter to the Soviet Union. And then once he got in there, he was a bit too independent. And it depends on who you read. Some say he was trying to really nationalize Iranian oil. Others say, nah, he was just asking for a percentage, where the Brits were basically completely screwing them and paying them nothing for all the oil that they were pumping out of there. And so the Brits and the Americans worked together to do a coup, and really the Americans did the coup and ended up winning for American oil interests in Iran rather than British ones. But that was the famous coup of 53, where they overthrew Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah. Now, the Israelis also got along with him essentially that whole time, I think. And
Iran really did well in that period. He was very harsh as a leader, and Iran was definitely not a democracy; it's a monarchy. But Iran didn't it do well economically, and even became a very secular country under the Shah.
Well, I don't know about the whole country. I know that there's, they can always show you kind of Potemkin pictures of Tehran or Kabul and go, oh, look, women in skirts. And so they
exactly. I've seen those the skirt.
Yeah,
skirts.
it was
like Iran before and
Paris.
after.
Yeah, I think, obviously there was some amount of progressive feminist type things in both countries, and in both cases led to pretty harsh right-wing reaction as well. Although I think probably all that progressivism is mostly overstated in the first place. But yeah, the Shah was a modernist, not like some reactionary theocrat type. But, and he did have a ruthless secret police force called the Savak that was trained by the Israelis and, to ruthlessly enforce his control there. And then...
Sorry, did you say trained by the Israelis? The
Yeah.
Savak?
Yeah.
Oh, that's open information, yeah? Not disputed?
Should be, yeah. I guess I can't remember a specific footnote for that, but I know that from a long time ago. I don't know. I'm sure you could find that.
It's just fascinating how the world works.
I think I read a reference to that before. See, this is why I'm skipping ahead here, but this is the solution to the mystery of how Israel was able to maintain their relationship with Iran after the revolution, is because the Ayatollah kept the intelligence services. He just told them, you work for me now. And so they were like, all right. But so it's the same guys. So there are plenty of opportunities for all those channels of communication to stay open, essentially, right? So it's not that Israel showed up after the revolution. It's that Israel did not bug out because of it. They just kept their relationship going, if that makes sense.
Just a quick curveball. Do you think, and we'll get back to it, do you think those same relations allowed them to be able to infiltrate Iran as they did in the latest war? Could those same relations be kind of nurtured over even decades?
I could not tell you the history of Israeli covert ops in Iran in the 70s and stuff. I just not my expertise there.
Just came to my mind when you said the Savak was trained by Israel, and then the Savak remained there after the revolution. So I'm like, hold on, because the way that Israel infiltrated Iranian intelligence during that war was just mind-boggling to me.
It'd be very interesting to read like some in-depth journalism about how that was accomplished, especially from Iranian sources, not just Israelis crowing about it, but I don't know if we'll ever really know. They have pretty heavy censorship there. But all right, so I think it's important to explain that in the aftermath of Vietnam, Nixon was the one who's really, it took him a long time after the first term. He really started getting us out of Vietnam, and he had to figure out a way to make it up to the military industrial complex. So he convinced the Shah to increase arms purchases from the United States. That's why you're familiar with the Iranians have F-4s and F-14 fighter jets, right? They got those from Nixon and Ford. And that was a big part of a favor essentially to the United States to help bolster the military industrial complex to kind of, placate them after ending the Vietnam War.
When, if you mind me asking, when did they get those jets? It's under the Shah, correct?
Yeah. So like between what, 72 and 79. You know, I'm not sure like when all the deliveries came, but it was, you know, I'm not sure if any of them happened in the Carter years, but they definitely happened in the Nixon and Ford years. So, but this is a problem because this is a lot of money in a relatively poor country, and a lot of people going without while the president is, you know, got this lavish spending on unnecessary weapons and stuff. There's a clip on YouTube you can find of Jimmy Carter toasting the Shah and saying, "Oh, this is a tribute to you, Your Majesty, and because of the stability of your country that is based on the people's respect for your rule," or something like that, which is totally wrong, right? He's like a year away from everything coming unraveled. And what really happened was the Shah had cancer and was, I think he fled, and it was different degrees of people inside the regime who knew that he was sick, and he had a massive,
even his son didn't know he was sick back then.
Yeah, but the CIA did.
Secretive.
And the CIA knew that he was dying. They knew that it was not there was no saving him. And so they were trying to figure out how to proceed. And some advocated that we work with the military to just crush the revolution and kill people and force them to go home, force the rest to go home. And which they were reluctant to do. And then they were advised by the CIA and the State Department to support the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was then in exile in France. He had been in Iraq and then in France. Now, I remember even as a little kid wondering, yeah, but ain't the French our friends? And we hate this guy and we didn't want him to take over the revolution. Why would the French do that to us? Right? I always wondered why nobody else wondered that. But of course, the answer was the Americans told the French to put him on the plane and send him home. And you can even see on YouTube right now, Peter Jennings from ABC News is on the plane with him and says, "So, Mr. Ayatollah," this idiot, this is all I can think of to say, "So, how do you feel about your return to Iran?" And the thing is, the CIA and the State Department, and I guess the CIA particularly, said, "We know this guy. He was part of a group of conservative Shiite clerics who helped agitate against Mossadegh in 1953. So we could work with him. He's all right." And William Sullivan from the State Department, maybe he was the ambassador to Iran, told Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski that, yeah, no, this guy's great. He's like the Iranian Gandhi, right? Which is funny because, like, of course, Gandhi means, oh, he's just such a peacenik, right? He's a pacifist. But then also, wasn't Gandhi the guy that kicked the empire out of India? Like, if you guys are paying attention, he might declare independence from you, this guy. But so that was why they sent the Ayatollah back to inherit the revolution. They thought that was their best bet at the time. And the problem.
And the Ayatollah, did the Ayatollah know that the US okayed him coming back from France to Iran?
Oh, I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. I mean, the French would have never sent him back without approval from Washington. He had to have known that, right? It was obvious. But now here's the thing, though. Everybody always conflates the revolution with the hostage crisis. But the hostage crisis was 10 months later, or 9, right? So the revolution was in January and February of 2000, like early 2000 of 79, right? End of 78, beginning of 79, like the very beginning of February 79. Then America spent the next months warning the new regime about threats from the new dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who'd just taken over in a bloody coup, and warning about threats from the Soviet Union. Now, what's funny about that is that same year, 79, America had started pouring money into the Mujahideen in Afghanistan because they were trying to provoke the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. They'd given up on containment after Vietnam. The American people had Vietnam syndrome, they call this mental illness, where they didn't want to fight wars against communism all the time. So they said, you know what? Like, we don't want them to move into West Berlin or West Germany, but what if we encourage them to invade Afghanistan? As you just said, give them their own Vietnam. What's Vietnam? Vietnam is when you kill yourself. Vietnam is when you get involved in a far-flung, no-win, super expensive quagmire that breaks your bank and destabilizes your country back home. It's shooting yourself in the foot and the knee. It's what you should not do. So they said, yeah, that's what we'll do. is we'll get them, we'll like inflict on them a quote self-inflicted wound. We'll get them to screw themselves in the same way we just got done doing. And so that was why they started pouring money into the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Then the Soviets did invade in December, and they said, oh no, now we're afraid that they're going to invade Iran too. And if they invade Iran too, then they'll dominate the Persian Gulf. And so after the failed rescue of the hostages, I'm skipping a part. So then, sorry, I'm skipping around a little bit, but
no. So,
let me just mention real quick. Let me just say real quick that in backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that also included Arabs from all over the place.
That became, just for the audience, they became Al-Qaeda and Taliban.
Later on, these are, well, Taliban is a little bit different story, but the Arab Afghans, the International Islamic Brigades, this was the core of what became Al-Qaeda later, while they're supporting the Mujahideen, the local Mujahideen as well. All right. But so then in Iran, there was the hostage crisis broke out because David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And then the idea was people thought they're going to nurse him back to health and then cancel the revolution and reinstall him in power again. And so that was what led to the hostage crisis. I'm not justifying, but I'm just saying we've been trying to get along, and we had been getting along with the Ayatollah from the beginning of February through, I think, the middle of November, warning him about Saddam's intentions and warning him about Soviet intentions, right? Then after the hostage crisis and the failed rescue operation, Operation Eagle Claw, Carter was humiliated and launched, and in his State of the Union address of 1980, announced the new Carter Doctrine that essentially said no other power, read the USSR, better ever try to dominate the Persian Gulf, because from now on it's an American lake. It belongs to us, and war guarantees for everybody. So don't even try it. Now, I only just learned this from Gareth Porter the Great, that he found it in the secret State Department declassified archives, where Brzezinski met with the Saudi foreign minister, and he had his deputy, Warren Christopher, who was later Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, with him. And he said, we don't really think the Soviets are going to invade Iran. We're just bluffing. That's just an excuse for our policy. You understand? He knew he was lying. He admitted that just weeks later. And they announced the entire Carter Doctrine of American total domination of the Persian Gulf, which we already had to deal with the Saudis since the Second World War. But they started building bases all over the place. They announced the creation of Central Command, and they gave a green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. Now, why would Saddam Hussein want to invade Iran? We just finished warning Iran, Saddam Hussein might invade you for a year. Now, Jimmy Carter tells the Saudis to tell Saddam, go for it. Why? Okay, one, Carter was humiliated and he wants to stick it to the Ayatollah, right? But two, the real question, why did Hussein want to attack Iran? Hussein wanted to attack Iran because, pull up the map in your head of the Middle East now, and that goes for everybody. All that land from Baghdad, east and south, down to Kuwait and east to the Iranian border, that's all predominantly Shiite territory, right? Supermajority Shiite territory. Saddam Hussein is a Sunni Arab sitting on a 20% minority dictatorship. The other 20% in the north are Kurds, who they're Sunnis, but they're Kurds, not Arabs. So they're also.
He was worried about a revolution in Iraq similar to Iran.
That's exactly right. So he's a 20% minority Sunni Ba'athist secular dictator sitting on a 60% supermajority Shiite population. And they have a huge popular revolution that just succeeded in the name of God next door. Now, Shiite Islam was born in Iraq and moved into Iran from there. So, and you had Iraqi Shiite leaders who were taking their men and moving to Iran. They were going to Iran to join with the revolution. And Hussein was afraid that the revolution was going to come to Iraq and that the Iraqi Shiites would choose their religious sect over their ethnic and national sect as Arabs and Iraqis. And they would say, hey, we're all Shiites together here, and march on Baghdad. So what he did was he conscripted them all and sent them to war with Iran to try to destroy the new regime instead, which America thought at that time was a great idea, right? And so that was why Jimmy Carter started backing Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran throughout the entire, which Ronald Reagan picked up and continued throughout the entire 1980s. Go ahead.
So Saddam Hussein, which obviously was the enemy of the U.S. in the second Iraq-US war, was initially an ally of the US. Khomeini, which is, the Islamic Republic, is now an enemy of the US. The US just bombed it just a few months ago. Was in the early days, at least on positive terms with the US, and the US had the opportunity to normalize relations with Iran, but for various different reasons that kept getting more and more complex. And no, there's one more. Sorry, I forgot to mention. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan initially were very strong allies of the US, and there was a movie, Rambo. Wasn't Rambo based on the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? And they were
Rambo 3
portrayed as Rambo 3 was portrayed as heroes there. So Al-Qaeda, which 9/11, probably America's worst enemy in our generation, was allied with the US. So just very brief without going too much in the weeds, because I know we've gone way over time, and I could go on.
It's okay, man. I got a little while. Let's go. Sorry.
All right. So how, like, for people listening, Scott, and what we're saying now is facts. Like, we're not going down conspiracy theories, etc. People could dispute different aspects. Like, did Saddam Hussein really get a green light from the US to go at war in Iran, or was the US more a bit vague?
Yeah, no.
Okay, I'd love to footnote.
Yeah,
I want to give footnote, and then so give us a footnote on this, and maybe also explain it for the audience. Like, how the hell did all these allies or friends of the US a few decades ago became enemy number one for the US?
Right. Okay, so first of all, the footnote for that is Robert Perry found the secret documents where Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, his first Secretary of State, went to the Middle East to meet all the allies and then came back and briefed Reagan. And he says, Prince Fahd, who later became King Fahd, Prince Fahd confirmed to me that Carter had given him the green light to pass to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. And you can read that at consortiumnews.com by the great journalist Robert Perry, who had been at the Associated Press and Newsweek back in the days when he found that stuff. So, and there are plenty of other indications as well, but I'd have to go back and get specific citations for you. But so this is the thinking at the time, and I'll try to do this fast because I am taking too long here. And I know you want to ask me a little bit about Gaza and all that too. So the thing is this.
We could do, Scott, we probably could do another sit down in a few days about Gaza, because I know this goes pretty deep and pretty complex.
Okay.
Because I just love the way you articulate how the Middle East got to where it is today. Like, you articulate in such an interesting way and how it's all interlinked, that I think will just, allow people to understand that this could have been prevented. But I'll let you continue.
Sure. Yeah. So, and that's fine. We could do it next week. Maybe we'll catch up and do Israel-Palestine. We'll leave it sort of in the background. Now, in my book, Enough Already is about all these Middle East wars. And I also leave Israel-Palestine in the background there because it's just too much to include. So there's a bit of it, but it's, whatever, but we can do a separate thing on that. But so anyway, I'll try to go faster here. So America's backing Saddam Hussein against Iran because their support for the Ayatollah and the revolution had blown up in their face, right, and not worked out. So also they had backed the Mujahideen to bog down the Soviets in Afghanistan. Now, at the end of the 1980s, Saddam Hussein has a problem with war debts with the Middle Eastern monarchies, particularly Kuwait, and also they're slant drilling or at least overproducing from shared oil wells on the border. And long story short here, America essentially told Saddam Hussein that he had flashing yellow light at least to go ahead and invade Kuwait and take back the northern oil fields to punish them or take them.
Kuwait and Saudi funded Saddam Hussein in the war against Iran, which lasted about 8 years. And it was just a disgusting, heartbreaking war. It was just a very
it was a really bad war. Yeah.
It was the chemical weapons. So Iran, and one more question as well. Where did Iraq get their chemical weapons as well? If you don't mind covering that very quickly.
Yes. Yes. American support for Hussein in the 1980s did include support for his obtaining chemical weapons. I believe the chemical weapons themselves came from Europe, but America gave him the precursors for anthrax and all that stuff he got from the United States. They built him a biological weapons program. They really did. And you can read all about this stuff. And he ended up having a rudimentary nuclear weapons program that was only found in the aftermath of the first Iraq War. So what happened was he invaded Kuwait. The Americans essentially told him he could. And then they changed their mind because of the Brits and pressure from Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain. And so then they said, we'll just use this as an excuse to launch a war. It'll be a quick, clean and easy, happy war. And we'll get the American people back in the martial spirit. And it'll be a great kind of thing. And it worked. And Americans remember Iraq War I as They call it the Gulf War or Operation Desert Storm. The air war lasted, I guess, a month. And then the ground war lasted 100 days or 100 hours. It was a 100-hour ground war. And so everybody USA #1, yellow ribbons and American flags and whoop their ass and all that. But the problem is this. I mean, there are a lot of problems with all the lying and dying and everything. But in the aftermath, America encouraged the Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, the Kurds too. And they started to. But then Bush changed his mind. Bush Sr., this is now. Why did he change his mind? He changed his mind because the Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side when the Iranian Revolution broke out and fought for them even in the war, they were now coming across the border and they were leading the revolution. So they realized, oh no, we literally, like, these are Ronald Reagan's guys. This is Reagan's third term under Bush Sr., that we just supported Hussein for a decade to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we're the ones importing it into Iraq and we're about to enthrone it in Baghdad. Oops. And so they called it off and they let Hussein keep his tanks and helicopters and kill 100,000 people to crush that insurrection. Now the problem with that is then that became the excuse for America to stay in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden and the other Bin Ladenite kooks from Afghanistan, from the International Islamic Brigades, they wanted to expel Iraq from Kuwait. And they were pissed that the Americans got the invite instead to come. But then on top of that, like to the 10th power, man, to the 100th power, they stayed. White Christian combat forces on not just their land, like Texas soil, but holy land, birthplace of their religion of Mecca and Medina. And so to the Bin Ladenites, they immediately denounced their own regime. Bin Laden denounced the king and, called him an infidel and all of this stuff and got kicked out of the country. And this was the start of the Bin Ladenites' turn against the United States. Now, the rub here is that America kept backing them anyway. And Bill Clinton's government used them in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Chechnya. Because as long as they're killing Serbs or killing Russians, or as we saw later under Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden, as long as they're killing Shiites, then the Bin Ladenites are fine with us. And so
that's the groups allied with Sunni Bin Laden,
that's right,
architect of 9/11.
Right. And so they had been attacking us all through the 90s. So you got the assassination of Rabbi Kahane in 1990, the first World Trade Center bombing in 93, the attack on Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 95, and then the Bojinka plot that was busted in the Philippines in 95, where they were going to blow up 12 planes with time bombs over the Pacific and hijack 10 planes and kamikaze crash them into targets on America's coasts. That was all from 1995. We knew that was coming. People paying attention. Then in 96, they blew up the Khobar Towers. In 98, they attacked the American embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya. And then in 2000, they blew up the USS Cole. Now, that was not a CIA inside job. That was the CIA saying, who cares, dude? As they said at the Pentagon, terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. We get to rule the world, and occasionally some nut sets off a truck bomb. Who cares, dude? Doesn't mean nothing. We don't care about that. Not really. Zbigniew Brzezinski himself told a French magazine in 1998, what, are we supposed to be concerned about some stirred up Muslims? How's that compare to the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern Europe? Support for the terrorists in Afghanistan got the job done, lady. I don't want to hear it, he says, right? And so this is paying the cost for that. Now, there's a quote from, I think it must have been Paul Wolfowitz, is a quote from a Bush administration official saying it is true that it is our bases in Afghanistan that turned bin Laden against us. And if we had only gone to Baghdad back then we wouldn't have had to keep the bases in Saudi Arabia. And then Osama bin Laden would probably be just redecorating his mosque and telling stories of the old days instead of targeting us now. And in fact, he said on the record, Wolfowitz said that, yes, Al-Qaeda was primarily motivated by our bases in Saudi Arabia. And that's why we need to invade Iraq, so we can move our bases to Iraq instead. Get them the hell out of Saudi Arabia. He said that to Vanity Fair on the record. So this was their thinking at the time, with part of it, or at least excuse making, but they recognized that this is why they hate us. This was the problem was our bases in Saudi that we kept to bomb and blockade Iraq, to keep the embargo against Iraq, and to bomb those so-called no-fly zones in the name of protecting the Shiites and the Kurds, who, after all, the insurrection had already been put down. It's not like Hussein was going to kill every last Shiite till he was done or whatever. It was a ridiculous thing. But that was the excuse to stay. And then the other motives on the list were American support. So first and second is American bases in Saudi from which to bomb Iraq. Okay. Then support for Israel in their tyranny and brutality against the Palestinians and the Lebanese. Support for the dictators across the Middle East. Support pressure on them to rig the oil price to subsidize our economy at their expense. And then, as bin Laden put it quite falsely, turning a blind eye to Russia and China and India and Kazakhstan's wars against Muslims, which in fact America supported the Mujahideen against the Russians, supported the Uyghurs against the Chinese. And I don't know about the Kazakhs, but he was right, though, that the current dictator of India, or the current leader of India, had helped lead a pogrom where like 20,000 people were killed. And the Americans said nothing about it. It was an anti-Muslim pogrom then. So they would harp on things like that. So in other words, just real quick here. One, these are guys that we backed in Afghanistan, and we kept backing them in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya, even though they were already attacking us throughout the 90s. Their motive was the bases, the Israelis, the tyrannies, the oil price, etc. Now the strategy was to hit America hard enough that we would react and we would invade Afghanistan, and they would replicate the same thing we did to the Russians, which was give them their own Vietnam and Afghanistan. We'll give you your own Afghanistan in Afghanistan. And that was
so
why
Al-Qaeda's plan was to drag the US into Afghanistan.
That
was part of their plan, to do exactly to the US what the US did with Al-Qaeda to the Soviets. So the US worked with Al-Qaeda, the Mujahideen back then, to drag the Soviets into their own version of Vietnam in Afghanistan that destroyed the Soviet army, stretched them thin, led to the fall of the Soviet empire. And then what Al-Qaeda then did is like, hey, let's do the same thing. Not sure if they worked with the Taliban or not. Let's do the same thing for the US. And the two main motivating factors, according to bin Laden, please correct me if I'm wrong, were the bases in Saudi and what's happening in Israel, Palestine. These were the two motivating factors, according to bin Laden, to strategically drag the US into Afghanistan. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I would hasten to add, because I'm kicking myself because I summarized it too quickly, and I forgot to say to really delineate and specify bases in Saudi from which to bomb and blockade Iraq and support for Israel, right? That's really the most important way to say it. Those bases weren't just sitting in Saudi. They were killing people all the time. And this is why in 96, what they do, they hit the Khobar Towers, which was barracks where American airmen were sleeping. They killed 19 of them. So it's pretty clear why they were the target there. And of course, what did Bill Clinton do? He blamed it on Iran, said that Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah did it for no reason whatsoever, when it was bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. And everybody knows it. The FBI knew it, the CIA knew it, and bin Laden himself took credit for it. That it was
But they blamed Iran for strategic reasons?
Yeah, because Saudi they wanted to deflect blame from bin Laden, and essentially the Americans went along with that. In fact, there's an anecdote about Louis Freeh, who is the lowest scum of the planet Earth, the former director of the FBI, and how they were on a plane home from Saudi, and the head of FBI counterterrorism, John O'Neill, told them, "Come on, boss, the Saudis are just blowing smoke up your ass about all this stuff about Saudi Hezbollah. Give me a break." And Louis Freeh, who was a member of Opus Dei or Opus Dei or whatever, the conservative Catholic faction, he went, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you used the A word in my presence. Man, get away from me. I never want to talk to you again." And it was supposedly how that anecdote played out, is the way it was told. That how dare O'Neill be so crude as to phrase it that way. But that was what the Saudis want. And to this day, they insist that Mark Dubowitz and the Israel lobby, of course, they have a major interest in trying to blame everything that explodes on Iran, whether they had anything to do with it or not. And so they still push that lie to this day. But bin Laden himself took credit for it to Abdel Bari Atwan. And it was so clear. What did they do? Why does Iran care if America's got airmen bombing Iraq? from bases in Saudi. They
Which
don't care about
exactly,
that.
that's their enemy. That's a good thing for Iran. That was their
Bin Laden's
previous
issue.
enemy.
That's Osama bin Laden's issue, not the Ayatollahs. And what did Bill Clinton do? Did Bill Clinton bomb Tehran? No, because that was nonsense, and he knew it. They're just going along. And anyway, so this is why they attacked us. They were trying to provoke the Afghan war, and then they did, and it worked. And America went and broke their bank, and we got kicked out the long way and the hard way. Now our empire didn't fall apart entirely the way the USSR did, because we're not communists, and so we still produce some things. But they sure did spend a hell of a lot of money, man. Think of what Biden said about Russia and Ukraine. We're going to inflict on them a strategic defeat. Same thing Bin Laden is trying to do to us. Now, if you are a band of 400 terrorists, outlaw bandits hiding out in no man's land in Nangarhar province, how do you wage war against a superpower? You got to get them to run and then trip them, right? You got to do a little judo and slam their head into the wall. Otherwise, they're going to crush you, of course, right? But the whole game is to get America to destroy itself, to give George Bush an excuse to ruthlessly exploit. And then, as his son said, Omar bin Laden said, when Bush was elected, my father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country. Get it? So bin Laden, the thing is, man, and this is why so many people are 9/11 truthers and whatever, is because they said the Taliban did it because they hate our freedom. Are you kidding? A bunch of cavemen from the town of Bedrock out there in the Kandahar province, they're mad because of the Bill of Rights or something? No, man, that wasn't it. It was American foreign policy, and it wasn't a bunch of cavemen. Osama bin Laden had an engineering degree. He was the son of a billionaire. Ayman al-Zawahiri was an Egyptian surgeon from Cairo. These guys were upper class guys, educated, worldly guys, not a bunch of illiterate redneck hillbillies from Pashtunistan. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Didn't bin Laden say something along the lines that if it was about your freedom, why didn't I bomb Sweden or some European country?
Exactly.
So he made it very clear that, hey, this is not the issue. He made the issue very, very clear. And the two on top of the list were the Iraqi bases bombing Iraq. Sorry, the US bases in Saudi bombing Iraq. And number two is what's happening in Israel, Palestine, which I think...
And Lebanon.
And Lebanon, of course, in the war in Lebanon. There's still a lot to unpack. So I'd love to do another sit down for you. I think people really appreciate, because I do a lot of these interviews on what's happening today and what could happen next. But I think understanding the context of it all when it comes to the Ukraine peace talks and the ongoing wars in the Middle East, Hezbollah's, the Lebanese government is trying to disarm Hezbollah. Iran is recovering from a 12-day war. What's going to happen next? People still understand, okay, then what? And then obviously Israel's just entering Gaza City as we speak. So there's a lot there to unpack. It's been an incredible discussion. I just respect you so much for people could disagree with you as much as they like, but the amount of work and effort you've put into this, over 20 years on your show, over 6,000 interviews, is something admirable. And I really appreciate your time. I appreciate this discussion, and I would love to have another one again as we unpack all this, Scott. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. And you're right. This is a good place to stop because, we're like right at 9/11 and the start of the terror wars.
It gets uglier and uglier.
So we can do
and it just gets
and then Iraq War II and Syria and all that the next time in, because it all does revolve around Israel policy, of course.
And it saddens me what the US, it's the biggest democracy in the world. And, as much as you want to criticize the US, I still would like to live there. I lived in Australia. I'm Australian, so I'd love to live in the US, Europe, Australia, than China, Russia, and I'm a believer in democracy. But it's sad to see the path that the country's gone down for various complex and kind of silly reasons in some cases. So we'll do that again in another interview. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.